Hello, chess fans. Today we're looking at another game of Mikhail Tal's from the 1957 Soviet Championship, the first championship that he won at the age of 20. As he said himself, in the following round, the 17th, I played a game which brought me half a point, enormous satisfaction, and a special prize. I don't actually know what the prize was, but in any case, here is the game. Tal opens the game with d4, and we're going to zip through the opening relatively quickly here. I don't find the opening all that interesting until Tal decides to make it interesting. We are seeing a Tarrasch defense, but after an exchange on c5, the resulting position is one that can often really become symmetrical after an exchange of the d pawn for the c pawn, and the position could quickly become sapped of any interest and energy. However, after these moves, Tal really ups the ante. In this position, he goes ahead and castles queenside. Now, personally, I am not brave enough to play this move. I'm also not convinced that it's really all that good of a move. I think if Black had played a little more incisively, this could become questionable. To me, the white king after castling here is looking around going, hey, where's my protection? You just put me on the queen side and you've pushed your A, B, and C pawns and you don't even have a D pawn. Who's protecting me? Fortunately for Tal, his opponent doesn't really play the most incisive moves in my opinion, and he, to put it mildly, gets away with it here and manages to create a fascinating opposite sides castling position. The game is certainly still tense. We shouldn't think that the game is lost for Tal just because he's castled on the queen side, but it's very risky and kind of a don't try this at home sort of move. In any case, his opponent now plays queen e7, which feels a bit slow, maybe a5 instead. And then we get knight b5 from Tal, which is interesting, going after the dark squared bishop. And we get knight e2 d7. Knight takes d6, picking up the bishop pair, although that's not the most important thing on the board here. And now queen c3. It was already actually good to play g4, and I want to show that because the variations are interesting. Of course, this idea is coming. When you're castled on opposite sides, you've got to push for an attack, and you've got to use your pawns in that attempt to attack. At this point, it's already suicidal for Black to take here on g4. Rook g1 lining up on the g file is great, and if you pull back, bishop d3 already threatens to take here because the knight can't take because g7 would hang. And if you play g6, we can already sacrifice our way through here. If you take the bishop and the rook here, simply queen h5 check. Notice that the queen's not hanging to the knight because of the pin, leads to rook g1 check, and you can only throw a queen in the way, and then you are checkmated. Instead, Tal plays a little more slowly here with the move queen c3 instead of the immediate g4, but after rook e8, another really slow move that I don't understand from Aronin here, we do get pawn g4 from Tal, a move that really says, brace yourself, I'm coming for you. Queen f8 now, another move I have to be honest, I don't fully understand, and then bishop to d3. I'll mention here that instead of bishop d3, c5 was also interesting. Throughout the game, Tal really declines the opportunity to play pawn c5, but it's really a nice idea to close down the queen side a little bit, but Tal seems to want to keep his pieces active, and he doesn't seem to be at all troubled by this pawn tension here, even though his king is sitting on the c file. So he never does play c5, although at many points here and much earlier, it could have been a very good positional idea. It's certainly one that I would have wanted to play. In any case, after bishop d3, knight b6, another move that I don't think gets enough counterplay. Pawn g5, going for it. Knight a4, obviously very nice idea. Of course, Black wants to exchange the dangerous dark squared bishop here. Queen back to c2, knight takes b2. You could here have thrown in pawn takes f6. You can check out the notes if you want to see more about this move, but I don't think White's really getting enough here for the exchange that White would be sacking here, and instead Tal just recaptures, which makes a lot of sense. After pawn takes c4, he does choose at this point to capture on f6, but it was probably better just to take back. Queen takes c4, knight d5, knight e5, gives White a real bind. This bishop can't move, the knight's amazing, and Tal's still attacking here, so this is a very, very nice position for White, and his king doesn't feel at all exposed right now, even though the a3 and b4 pawns have been advanced. Instead, he goes ahead and captures on f6, allowing his dark squared or light squared bishop to be captured. And after queen take d3, we get pawn to e5. Now, this is a really good move. If Aronin had not played this move, and maybe Tal underestimated the strength of this move, then the position would basically be a bust for black. This move lets out the bishop, which also means that this rook can get into the game. And of course, it's threatening pawn to e4. So very good ideas from Aronin. At this point, one thing to mention is that if Tal had captured here, of course, you're never going to take back and have the g-file be opened. Instead, you play queen e7, and Stockfish actually already likes black here, which is kind of hard to believe because you are up a pawn, even if it is this pawn. But now there's really no ability to attack on the g-file for white anymore, and we start to see counterplay become possible for black. So really interesting. Stockfish already likes black here, but certainly we can understand that putting a pawn on g7, if black doesn't capture it, can slow down your own play on the g-file. Your own pawn gets in the way. Unlike an opponent's pawn, you can't capture your own pawn. So, in any case, after pawn e5, we get knight to g5, threatening mate, and then pawn g6, pawn h4, obviously going for it. You got to go for it. Bishop f5, pawn e4, and bishop g4. At this point, Aronin is close to shutting the action down on the king side. If he gets to play bishop h5, even though white's pieces look ominous around the black king, there won't be any way to break through. So Tal has to go for it in this position, and he does so with pawn to h5, playing to open the h-file, not worrying about the pawn possibly being captured, and not worrying about his d3 rook possibly being hanging. So now things get really interesting. I love the game from this point on. First off, if bishop takes h5, you are of course going to sacrifice for the bishop here to open the g-file. At this point, I'd encourage you to pause your videos if you want to figure out how white wins. There's one completely decisive move that I would not have considered. It's queen b3. It makes sense to go for it on the g-file, but rook g1, queen h6 actually makes the task hard for white. Instead, after queen b3 lining up on f7, black has no way to do anything productive in this position. So the simple idea of rook g1, when you're going to make all kinds of discoveries like knight takes f7, is completely overwhelming. This is like a plus 10 position. There's like no move you can suggest for black. In any case, after h5, black realized that if you capture here, then the rook sacrifice is coming. So we get rook d8, attacking the queen and also lining up more pressure against the already attacked rook on d3. At this point, we get a brilliant move. H takes g6. Tal sacrifices his queen in this position, and after Aronin captures it, he simply takes back, leaving this incredible tension right here. He didn't even try to capture some material here because it wouldn't be enough material. At this point, we're obviously seeing a ton of pressure down here, and black goes ahead and captures with the h-pawn so as not to leave the h7 pawn hanging. And now rook h7. I love this position. There's not a lot of pieces left, but even though white has sacrificed the queen for only a rook, the rook on h7, knight on g5, and pawn on f6 totally tie down the black pieces. There's just not enough that you can move. There's also ideas of rook g7 check when a knight capture on f7 or knight h7 might be mate. So you're really struggling to do anything productive here from black. And actually, it's black that has to walk a tightrope and find good defensive moves. Already, there was the possibility of rook e6, which is a good idea. Black desperately needs to give back material to unwind. Going after f6 is a way to do it. But after knight takes e6 here and bishop takes e6, rook g7 check, we simply come back and there's no way to deal with this threat. You can play bishop h3, rook d3, but the bishop is not stable, and as long as it cannot stably block the h-file, then black can't win. This is a draw. It's not a win for Tal, but we can continue to harass the bishop and threaten mate on the h-file, so we are able to hold the balance against the move rook e6, giving back material. Instead, black plays rook to c8 in this position. Then we get pawn f3, trying to chase the bishop away from its good post right here. It's actually doing a good double duty here, thinking about playing to h5 if needed, and also keeping the white rook out of d7. If it had pulled back to h5 right now, we would simply go into d7, and now f7 falls, and when it does fall, we're winning scads of material and dominating the position. Also, if the bishop had gone back to e6, then we simply have rook back to d2, rook h2, and once again, the idea of rook g7 is crushing. So it is time for black to go after the f6 pawn. You have to go after f6 right here. If you don't go after f6, you are getting crushed. So we leave the bishop hanging and attack f6. Tal plays rook takes f7 now. And at this point, you cannot save the queen. If you try, you get mated. Rook g7 check. And if you go to the corner, then you have knight f7 and checkmate. And if you go the other way, it's only a little longer until checkmate as we get rook to e7, which is very pretty. So in the game, instead we get rook takes f7, and now Aronin gives up his queen, and we get into a rook endgame. And unfortunately, at this point, it's actually a pretty balanced rook endgame. We only get a few more moves from the players. Black does get after the kingside pawns, but white's rook is the most active, and it's tying black down to b7. In fact, after king takes g4, the players agreed a draw. Black is up a pawn at the moment, but white may actually have the advantage. After b5 and then king c5, you're going to win b7, and the b pawn might be the most dangerous pawn on the board, although the black g pawn is pretty good too. I've included a sample variation for how the game might have concluded, but the basic upshot is that both players get dangerous passed pawns and will then have to sacrifice their rooks for those pawns, leaving nothing but kings on the board. That's actually very common in rook endgames like this, as you get down to relatively little material and both players start to have dangerous pawns. In any case, this was a wonderful draw. Just because a game is drawn does not mean it's not exciting. I hope you enjoyed the variations and the way that Tal, with very little material, was able to hold off the black queen and even have some ideas to win the game. If you liked the video, then please do like and subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of future videos. And also check the playlist for more of Mikhail Tal's greatest games, and come back each week as we look at another of Tal's games going chronologically through his fantastic career.